You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our guest right now is Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier. He is a scholar of Jewish history. He is a Musmech of Yeshiva University. In fact, his latest book is called Contemporary Uses and Forms of Chassidut, published by YU Press. Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure.
You know, one of the reasons I had you here, there's a fascinating piece of Jewish history which a lot of people don't know about. And after the light of Hanukkah, shortly thereafter, they have what's called 3 dark days during the Hebrew month of Teveth, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th. The 10th we know is the fast. It's related to the destruction of the temple. But the 8th and 9th is obscure, at least especially the 9th day is obscure to mystery. So perhaps you can clarify us what historians have said about these days, which have been deemed by leading rabbis and historians over the course of time as dark days in Jewish history.
For sure. So, as you said, the primary reason we fast on Asar B'Teves is because Yerushalayim was encircled in Bayis Rishon. It was sort of the beginning of the end of the first temple. But as it happens, there's 2 other bad things that took place on the 8th and 9th of Teves that we also commemorate on the 10th. And actually, this is mentioned in some of the slichos, some of the piyutim and slichos that we say on Asar B'Teves. So the slicha called Ezker Amatzok refers to 3 different bad things that happen and on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. So as you indicated, the 9th of Teves is a great mystery. We'll talk about that in a second. But just to mention the 8th, according to Jewish tradition, and this is from a source known as Megillas Tanis, the scroll of fasts, not the original Megillas Tanis written in Aramaic about what days one may not fast, but this is a Hebrew Megillas Tanis, a short list of days on which one should fast. Almost none of these are observed today. The Shulchan Aruch, writing the Beis Yosef, says that he doesn't know anyone who really keeps these fasts, but the 8th and 9th of Teves are sort of folded into the 10th, so they're not quite observed on their own, but they're part of what we commemorate on the 10th of Teves.
And days gone by, I think they fasted on the 8th and 9th and the 10th. Am I correct?
It's possible, but it doesn't seem like that's been in place for hundreds of years. So the extent that existed, it was a long time ago.
Right.
So the 8th of Teves is recorded as being the day that the Torah was translated into Greek on behalf of King Ptolemy. And it says that the world was dark for 3 days. So there's a whole other topic to be explored there. The attitude or different attitudes towards the translation of the Torah into Greek. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Certainly, those who would suggest fasting think it's a bad thing. But there are other sources in Chazal and Jewish tradition that talk about how the translation of the Torah into Greek is somehow qualitatively superior to other translations. And there's something about the beauty of Greek that's special. So there's a whole larger debate to be had about that. But certainly the tradition that says that we should fast on the 8th of Teves, and that's observed, sort of commemorated in part on the 10th of Teves, would say that that's a bad thing. And why does it say it was dark for 3 days? I think that's a reference to the Makkah of Choshech, the 9th of the plagues, where it was dark for 3 days in Egypt. Lo ro ishis achiv lo kamu ish mitachtav shlosh yamim. There may have been another 3 days, but the pasuk says there were 3 days in Egypt. And of course, Ptolemy was the king of Egypt, and he was the one who oversaw the translation. So maybe it was some reference of another bad thing happening in Egypt, leading to another 3 day of darkness. But that's just the 8th of Teves. We still haven't gotten to.
Before we go to the 9th, I'm smiling because they say that the miracle was, even though they say they translated the Torah into Greek and it was darkness descended onto the world, but the miracle was, they had 70 or 72 sages that were in separate rooms, and their translation was exactly the same. That was the miracle. So I think the joke was, the miracle wasn't that they were in 70 rooms or 72 rooms and that it came out the same. If they would have been in the same room, there would have been an even greater miracle. But that's an old Jewish joke. Anyway, go ahead.
72 Jews, 73 opinions.
But so that's the 8th day of Teveth. But the 9th day is where the real mystery is.
Yeah, and actually, if you look back at this original text, the original passage in Megillas Tanis, it says that there's a fast day on the 9th of Teves, and the rabbis didn't say for what reason. It explicitly says, Lo kasvu rabosenu al mahu. The rabbis didn't say what this fast is about, as opposed to all the other dates on this list. There's a couple dozen dates on this list, and each one it says this, this biblical figure died, this bad thing happened. All of them, there's a reason except for the 9th of Teves. And this, of course, leads to a series of suggestions as to what the cause is, with none of them being necessarily the clearest. The one that I think has is most well known and really appears in that piyut, appears in Ezra Matzok, is the suggestion that Ezra and maybe also Nehemiah die on the 9th of Teves. So if you look in that slicha, it says Taraf bo hanosein imrei shafer. On that day was killed the one who says wonderful things. Who? Ezra HaSofer. Ezra the scribe died on the 9th of Teves. It says that explicitly. Some sources say also Ezra died. So that's I think the most well-known suggestion. There's a couple of problems with this suggestion. One is that there actually are some sources that say that Ezra died on the 10th of Teves, not the 9th. So that's, if it's the wrong day, then that doesn't help you too much. It doesn't explain what the 9th is about. And also, there's the question as to why would this be a great secret, right? Why would the rabbis not say, if they said there's a fast day on the 9th of Teves, and it's because Ezra died, why would they not inform people of that? What's the need for secrecy? So there have been some suggestions, maybe, we wouldn't want, Ezra's so great, we wouldn't want people, worshiping him or hallowing the day of his death too much. So maybe that's why it wasn't released, but it's not the most convincing answer. It's a little, there's still some challenges with the standard answer that Ezra's death is the cause of the fasting on the 9th.
And the other problem might be is, why would we fast on the death of Ezra? We don't fast when Moshe Rabbeinu or Yehoshua or anybody else. There's even a question why we fast on Tzom Gedai, the fast of after Rosh Hashanah, but that they have a whole bunch of answers that it happened on the holiday and the sovereignty ended. But the death of Ezra didn't change anything significantly. So why would we fast on the death of Ezra?
Right. It's a fair question. And I think if you look at it in the context of this larger list, this Megillas Tanis, most of the fast days there are based on when people die, like Miriam dies or the sons of Aaron die. So there, it wouldn't be only Ezra, but still it's a little odd that the selection on that list, why some people and not others. I mean, Ezra's a pretty major figure, but as you said, why not Moshe, right? That's a little odd. If anything, people make a little tikkun, a little kiddush, of some sort around his, around Zion Adar. So it's a little odd, but in any event, we don't really observe any of these fasts, so it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But at least that's one suggestion that Ezra's death is the cause of the fast of 9th of Teves.
And interesting, just this year, I believe a bunch of Israelis try to go to Jordan for the yahrzeit of Aaron HaKohen in August. I think they got arrested when they tried to get into Jordan. But so there are some that commemorate, but I don't know if they were fasting, but they certainly were commemorating the day of his passing. And
very interesting.
Right. So here the 9th day is still shrouded in mystery. So there's no reason that's given why the fast is occurring. So there's all kinds of speculation. So let's look at some of the thoughts as to why the 9th day of Teveth, why it's shrouded in mystery, and why was it considered a dark day of fast day?
Yeah. So a couple of other suggestions. One from the Ravid, one of the Rishonim, he talks about the death of this fellow Rav Yosef or Yehosef Hanagid, who was a leader in Granada. His father is actually better known than him. Shmuel Hanagid was, they're both rabbis and political leaders in Granada. And apparently, Rav Yehosef Hanagid was murdered in 1066 on the 9th day of Teves. And the Ravid suggests maybe that's why the fast is on the 9th of Teves, to commemorate his death. The reason why it wasn't stated explicitly is because the fast began to be observed before he actually was killed. Because we know the Megillas Tanis was written earlier than the 11th century. It was written before. So it's, on the one hand, it explains why they didn't publicize it. You wouldn't want Rav Yosef to say, like, okay, I'm going to die one of these years on the 9th of Teves. That wouldn't be fun. But it's a little unusual that this would have been predicted in advance. And also, why would you have fasted for all those years before he actually died? And you also, of course, have the question of why would you fast for him as opposed to, let's say, his father, who's actually better known, or for many other people. So that's a suggestion made by the Ravid, but again, not necessarily the most convincing one.
Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier is our guest. He is a scholar of Jewish history. He's a Muslim of Yeshiva University. His latest book is called Contemporary Uses and Forms of Chassidut, published by YU Press. So here you have one theory as to why we fast on the 9th day of Teveth, which usually falls out in December. So what are some of the other reasons that they think might be the reason why people fast?
Yeah, one before we get to the December seasonal ones, just one quick one that the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, in his commentary Mechir Yayin on Esther, says that Esther was taken to Achashverosh's house in the 10th month. Vatil kach Esther el hamelech Achashverosh al beis malchuso b'chodesh ha'asiri hu chodesh Teves, and he says it was probably on the 9th of Teves, and that's why we fast to commemorate that. Also, a little, how do we know it's the 9th? Why would this be something worth mourning? Some more questions than answers on that approach. But two approaches that go in a very different direction, a little more seasonal in a sense. And I should acknowledge that Professor Schneur Lyman did a lot of the research on this, and I'm really building on and rehearsing his findings, some of his findings, especially on this. There's a couple of really fascinating suggestions made among both Achronim and some academic scholars in the 19th century. So the first of these suggestions, the Tosfos Chadashim, a commentary on this Megillas Tanis, says he heard that that on the 9th of Teves, that was the day that Oso Ha'ish, that person, was born. And of course, that person referring to Yeshu, referring to the historical character Jesus. And also various historians, Leopold Suntz and others, make reference to this suggestion. And the source, the earliest source connecting the possibility of Yeshu's birth to the 9th of Teves actually goes back to Sefer Ibur by Avram ben Barchia from Spain in the 11th and 12th century, where he, it's about different dates and dating things. And he says that he says that he had heard people arguing that the 25th of December in the year 1 was the 9th of Teves. And it's a little hard to calculate this because, they changed the way you calculate the calendar, but at least it's plausible nowadays, right? Often the 9th of Teves comes out right around the 25th of December. And if you accept that the 25th of December was the day that Yeshu was born, maybe that's the 9th of Teves. And the suggestion would be, just like there are various practices, Nittel Nacht, not studying Torah, the eve of the 25th of December, and maybe there also was a fast day observed not on the secular calendar, but observed on the Jewish calendar. And maybe that's why the 9th of Teves is a fast day. And the reason you wouldn't say the reason why you wouldn't publicize that the birth of Yeshu is the reason why one might fast is because, of course, that would backfire, right? The Christian neighbors might not be so happy about that. You wouldn't want to publicize that. However, Rav Avram Barchia himself is not happy with this answer. And he says, we actually don't have a good enough reason to believe that Yeshu was born on the 25th of December. Even though this is recorded in some sources, it doesn't appear in the earliest Christian sources in the New Testament, he points out. And he says, really, and this paraphrases a little bit of Gemara in Avodah Zarah, really the 25th of December was originally a pagan holiday based around the winter solstice. And then it was sort of co-opted by Christians as a holiday, tied to the birth of Yeshu. But he said there's not really any reason to believe historically that Yeshu was actually born on the 25th of December. And for that reason, he himself doesn't like it. And it's possible that this is the cause for the fast. But if it is, it's it faces the challenge of just not being the right date. Given the source, the more likely source of the 25th of December being a previous pagan holiday rather than the actual date of the birth of Yeshu.
Even though, by the way, Nittelnach, at night on the December 25th, some people have a custom not to learn Torah till at least midnight. So the question would be, is this unusual that it would go according to the Christian calendar, not the Jewish calendar? What they're saying was, logically, it should be the 9th day of Teves, if that indeed is the date, which we don't really know.
Right. Yeah. At least this would be an alternative. I don't. It would be interesting to see if someone wanted to, shift Nittel to be on the eve of Tes Teves. I don't know anyone who does that, but then again, I don't know anyone who fasts on Tes Teves either.
By the way, but I believe some hold Nittelnacht in January closer to the
true
Orthodox Church, not according to where we have it in the West.
Right, because they shifted the calendar by 11 days at some point. So do you use the new count or the old count? Right. Ironically, the both the Nittel Minhagim and of course different Christian groups have parallel machloksim about parallel debates about when to celebrate either for positive or negative.
But I know, but the conveying I think the most interesting theory that you mentioned, Professor Lyman, I know Professor Daniel Sperber has spoken about it as well, is the fact that it relates to the actual church itself, a prominent individual who was Jewish, but he was also sent by the rabbis to the church. So let's look at that one.
Yeah, and probably this is the most fascinating suggestion, which is that the 9th of Teves marks the death of this figure known as Shimon HaKalfus or Shimon HaKalfoni or similar, who, basically the word Kalfus means rock. It's a translation of the word Peter. So if you would translate this into English or Latin language, it would be Simon Peter. And this figure, if you look at Rav Baruch Frankel and his Hagahos, his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, it's printed in the back of the standard Shulchan Aruch. He says that he saw a manuscript somewhere that talks about the 9th of Teves as the day when Shimon HaKalfus died, and he says, Shehoshia es Yisrael b'tzara gedola, he saved the Jewish people in a great crisis, bisman haparitzim, in the time of those who were breaking the law, and therefore his death was set as a fast day, mourning his death as a great righteous person. It's not clear at all what he's talking about, right? The name Shimon HaKalfus doesn't appear in any classical Jewish source, but if you realize that the manuscript he's talking about and some others, Aaron of Worms in the 19th century also makes reference presumably to this, it seems like he's referring to Toldos Yeshu, which is basically the Jewish history of the life of Jesus. It's generally not so positively framed towards that character, but it tells the story, a sort of a Jewish version of the story of the origins of Christianity. And one of the main characters in this story, after the death of Yeshu, this figure Shimon HaKalfus takes over as the leader, and really he was sent by the Jewish leadership as like a double agent of sorts to try to get the early church to move away from some of its previous practice, because early on the early followers of Yeshu were Jews who still kept halacha, but they also believed that Yeshu was the Mashiach. They believed he was a messianic figure, but more or less they kept the same practice. And the rabbis sent this figure, this Shimon Kalfus, to convince Christians to keep the Shabbos on Sunday rather than Saturday, or to
he was meant to separate Judaism from Christianity. That should be distinct. It shouldn't be where you couldn't tell somebody was a follower of Jesus or Christianity because they kept the law, they kept Shabbos, kosher, sukkah, the whole works. So the only difference was they believed in Jesus. So his job, according to what's written and told us Yeshu, which by the way I believe it has no author that I know about, is that he was meant to separate the religion. So there's a distinct Christian religion completely separate from Judaism.
Exactly. And the more differences he could make in terms of practice, not doing bris milah anymore, changing different dates of holidays, etc., the easier it would be to split between the two communities, and that stopped the civil war, according to Toldos Yeshu. As you said, there's no single author. It's sort of been around for over a millennium. We don't know exactly who wrote it, and there's many different versions of it. But at least in some of the main versions, they say explicitly, this figure, Shimon HaKalfus, passed away on the 9th of Teves, and his death was set up as a day of mourning. So depending on how you date those versions of the story, if you think that goes back all the way to the time that Megillas Tanis was written, maybe that's the original reason for the fast on that date. And of course, you wouldn't say the reason why you're fasting, because you wouldn't want to let Christians know that their leader, this Shimon HaKalfus, is actually a double agent on behalf of the Jews, trying to save Judaism by distinguishing Christianity from it.
Our guest, Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier, a scholar of Jewish history. He is a Musmach of Yeshiva University. His latest book is called Contemporary Uses and Forms of Chassidut by YU Press. Was Paul or Simon, actually Peter, the only one sent by the rabbis? Because there may have been some others that were sent by the rabbis to do the same thing. as far as we know.
So yeah, just before we get into that, the name is a little tricky, right? So the Hebrew name that's used is Shimon HaKalfus, which translates to Simon Peter, but actually the activities of this figure seems to track much more with Paul, because if from the early Christian writings, Paul was the one who really moved away from the law, from the nomos, said not to follow. It was better not to follow law, not to circumcise, and all of these things. So it seems like the figure, this Shimon HaKalfus, is somewhat of a mix of Simon Peter, who was one of the disciples of Yeshu according to Christian tradition, and Paul, who was another follower and leader after him. But actually, what Paul did tracks more closely with these teachings.
But were there others too? Because they had some other Jewish leadership of the early church. Were they also in league with Paul or Peter, whatever his name was? And again, it's a little confusing, because Paul seemed to be more, like you said, who did the actual work, but Peter's the name that's being used. But were there some of the other ones as well that were on a similar track, as far as we know?
I haven't looked at every version of Toldos Yeshu, but certainly the version that seems like is being drawn upon in this context seems to really say it was primarily Shimon HaKalfus, who they actually say was the uncle of Yeshu. But they really they had a whole meeting. They said, why don't you're his uncle, you're well respected, you're going to be able to sway these minds, and why don't you go and become this double agent? And he agreed on condition that he get Olam Haba, that he receive a portion in the world to come. They agreed, and he went on his way. But as far as I know, it was primarily him in these sources.
Because if I believe Professor Lyman writes that John, Paul, Simon Peter, all of them Jews, that they transformed the language of the Romans into obscure one in order to separate them from Israel. So the Jews, were not apostates, rather they acted from the best of intentions so as to benefit the Jews. They saw that the Jews were oppressed by the deceitful acts of the followers of Jesus. They impersonated priests and ordained all the Christian laws and customs. The book has stated explicitly in Toldos Yeshu narrative.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there are multiple versions. It could be in a different version. There were more active roles, according to the Huldreich version I was looking at. The works of John or Johannes, or however it's presented, are actually said that Shimon HaKalfus forged them and presented it to them as if these were the writings of John, but originally they were his own suggestion. But yeah, there's really over 100 different manuscripts. No one's the same as the other, so there could be a variety of different traditions. The idea of making up the language, inventing the language. So that's based on a Rashi, based on the Dikduke Sofrim version of this Rashi at the beginning of Avodah Zarah, where he talks about Paul or Shimon HaKalfus, however you want to refer to him, as inventing the language. In some of the versions of Toldos Yeshu, you have this fascinating drasha, or midrashic interpretation of the Latin alphabet, like A, B, C, D, and it fits it all together. So A and B is A and Ba, that's Abba, that's the father, and it goes on. C is C, and D is Dalet, so that's Tzayid, which is associated with Esav, who's associated with Christianity. They go into a whole set of drushos associating the alphabet with basically some statement as to the divinity of Yeshu, but then that's also undermined. It's really fascinating.
It's not a pro Jesus book, Toldos Yeshu, but there are different versions. How many versions are there of the book?
It depends a little bit on how you count, because in theory you could say every manuscript is its own version, although there are and as I said, there's over 100 and none of them are identical, which is not surprising given that this is the sort of thing that had to be passed on in secret given the nature of what it was, and it was never really standardized and wasn't published until the 18th century. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, it was passed around sort of under the table. So, depending how you count, you can say there's over 100 versions. There is a smaller number of sort of overall, the overall content is the same, like clusters of versions. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of, coming up with like the sort of either a critical edition or sort of critical editions or more or less laying out the different main versions. I don't, there's been some work on that, but not enough. So I think we're not at the point where we can give a straight answer to the question of how many versions are there.
I'm surprised nobody has translated. I heard from Professor Daniel Sperber many years ago that he was going to be translating that, but I never heard anything since then.
Fascinating. So there is, I mean, the Holdreich version, which is one of the main versions, there is a translation I found online by this fellow, Joseph Gebhardt Klein. It's openly available online, and I think it was done relatively recently. But it's not. I don't think it wasn't done like a fully scientific way. I think it was more of a, I mean, it's an important resource. But yeah, I think there's definitely more work, and that's only one. That's only one of the versions. There's a lot more that into English, that is. But yeah, one could certainly translate the various versions. There's a lot there, and really, really creative. I found a lot of really creative midrashic work in Toldos Yeshu in its interpretations of, in the interpretations of these various texts.
What did you read in Hebrew or in Yiddish?
The version I read was Hebrew. Of course there is Yiddish. There are other languages too.
Yiddish one, yes. Uh-huh.
And I think the Holdreich edition translated it into Latin. If anyone's up for that.
If it meant Latin, it was meant for Christian audiences too.
Could be, yeah.
Right. It was if they were going to reach Jewish audiences, I don't think they would have written it in Latin. So that's why I'm wondering if that's what the purpose was. But it makes the most sense of all the theories that have been espoused about the fast of the 8th day of the month of Teveth, the 9th day, I should say. This probably makes the most sense, I would say.
It could be. I mean, I think there's two different ways it could work. One way it might work is people knew that there was this question about the 9th of Teveth and what it represented, and then someone put 2 and 2 together and said, aha, this must be the date that Paul died. So that's one way it could work, but that wouldn't explain the original Megillas Tanis. The alternative way of it working would be that that this source really goes back I don't know, 12, 13, 1400 years before the composition of Megillas Tanis. It's really hard to prove that. It's basically impossible to prove that. But if that is the case, if this tradition does go all the way back, then it might be the strongest answer. But it's hard to know, and it's that's why it's good. There's more than one answer, because hopefully at least one of them is right. And there's a lot we can commemorate all these things on either the 9th or 10th of Teveth.
But it's all incorporated into the fast of the 10th day of Teveth. So there's no day designated except for the 10th day of Teveth. And I guess we incorporate a variety of different reasons into that date. Rabbi is with us. Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier is with us. Before I let you go, your latest book is called Contemporary Uses and Forms of Chassidut. What is that about? Yeah,
so it's looking at some contemporary trends in both in America and Israel, primarily in modern and centrist Orthodox communities, but not only, of the sort of an increase in Hasidic practice among communities that haven't historically been Hasidic. And this is both practice and thought, and an increase in spirituality, Hasidic music, Hasidic hashkafa, and tracing it both in terms of intellectual history and in terms of sociology and anthropology in America and Israel. A series of essays on these different perspectives that I had the good fortune of editing, and it's really a fascinating book.
Now, I believe we're seeing the Hasidification of Orthodoxy. It's not just people who want to, adopt some Hasidic style and have singing and dancing in the middle of the prayers and make it a little bit more joyful. But I think there's been a Hasidification of Orthodoxy in general in lots of different ways. And this may be just one more manifestation of that.
Certainly true. Yeah, certainly a major theme. But there's a lot more to flesh out there.
We'll have to have you back for a future program. What's your next book going to be about?
My next book is going to be based on my dissertation, and it's going to be about issues of kapara and karbanos, atonement and sacrifice in ancient Judaism. So both Chazal and Second Temple Bayis Sheni sources.
Fascinating. When that's going to be out?
I don't have a specific date yet, but the book itself is just about done.
Our guest has been Rabbi Shlomo Zuckier. He's a scholar of Jewish history. He's a graduate. He's a Muslim of Yeshiva University. His latest book is called Contemporary Uses and Forms of Chassidut. It is published by YU Press. Rabbi Zuckier, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Zev.
Thank you for tuning in to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, talklinenetwork.com or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the talklinenetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.